1917, Australia. Every baby born that year was missing their eyes. The Darwin Case Study. It began in silence. Not the kind of silence that follows a storm, but the kind that fills a room and steals the air from everyone inside. In 1917, Darwin, a remote town in northern Australia, became the stage for something unexplainable, something terrifying. Mothers went into labor, expecting the wail of new life. But instead, a strange and unsettling stillness greeted them. Doctors leaned in close, nurses waited with trembling hands, but the cries never came. These infants breathed, their hearts beat, yet their tiny faces held something so disturbing that words failed those who saw them. Every baby born that year was missing their eyes. The first case was dismissed as a tragedy of nature, an unfortunate twist of fate. But when the second child came, then the third, then the 10th, horror settled over Darwin like a storm cloud that would not pass. Families gathered in whispers, churches filled with prayers, and in kitchens lit only by flickering lanterns, neighbors lowered their voices, too afraid to speak the truth aloud. The hospital records began to look like tombstones. Each entry listed not just a name and a date of birth, but a hidden detail, carefully scribbled in private notes. Ocular deformity, absence of eyes, empty sockets. Behind those words was a reality too gruesome to share publicly. Imagine being a mother, holding your newborn, staring into a face where eyes should have been, and seeing only skin. Some mothers screamed. Some fainted. Some turned away in silence, unable to look. Fathers carried the weight of disbelief, clutching their hats with trembling hands, wondering if their bloodline had been cursed. Rumors began spreading faster than the tropical storms that often lashed Darwin. Some said it was a punishment from God. Others claimed the town had been cursed by spirits, angered by the settlers' presence on Aboriginal land. Old men swore they'd seen omens, blackbirds circling the hospital roof, strange lights over the harbor at night. But while rumors grew, so did fear. No one felt safe anymore. Pregnant women wept quietly at night, praying their children would be spared. Husbands promised it wouldn't happen again, though none of them believed it. Even the midwives, women hardened by years of delivering babies, began to dread the sound of labor pains echoing through the ward. By the time the year ended, silence had replaced joy. Birthdays were no longer celebrated. Families avoided each other in the market, ashamed of what had happened behind closed doors. In Darwin, once a town defined by the hum of life at its edges, the sea, the storms, the markets, now lived in the shadow of fear. Because the silence of that year was not just about the babies who could not cry. It was about a community that stopped speaking, terrified that whatever had taken the eyes of their children might take more. But this was only the beginning. The records did not vanish. The fear did not end. And the question that hung in the humid Australian air was one no one dared to ask aloud. Why Darwin? Why 1917? The silence demanded an answer. The truth was not whispered in back alleys or carried in gossip. It was written in ink. In the fragile, yellowing pages of Darwin's hospital ledgers, the horror was preserved. Dates, names, and clinical notations, each one colder than the last. One entry from February 1917 read, male infant, full term, no ocular development. Another, in March, female infant, still breathing, both sockets absent. By June, the handwriting itself seemed to tremble, as if the pen had been guided by a reluctant hand. 7th case this month. No explanation. Doctors tried to bury their emotions under medical terms, but the words couldn't mask the reality. These weren't numbers or conditions. These were children. The staff at Darwin Hospital grew uneasy. Some of the midwives refused to assist in births anymore, claiming they could not bear to see another eyeless child. Others drank heavily after long shifts, tried to erase the images from their minds. One nurse confessed in her private journal that she woke every night to phantom cries, yet she knew none of the infants had ever cried. The ledgers filled up faster than anyone expected. Instead of recording healthy births, the columns became a ledger of despair. Families sometimes demanded that the entries be destroyed, desperate to erase the shame. But the hospital, bound by duty, kept them locked away. Hidden in dusty cabinets, the records grew into a secret archive of the unexplainable. Outside the hospital, whispers of those records spread like wildfire. Men who worked at the dock swore that every official was hiding the truth. Farmers arriving from the outback claimed they had heard the stories before even stepping foot in town. Yet no one could see the records for themselves. They remained under lock and key, guarded by administrators who feared public panic. But secrecy only bred suspicion. Why hide them if they weren't true? Why protect papers more than children? Some mothers demanded to see the entries with their own eyes, hoping that proof on paper would make their pain feel real, or perhaps less like a curse and more like science. They were turned away, told it was for the town's safety. Still, those who worked in the hospital could not keep silent forever. An orderly whispered to a friend in the market. A nurse spoke to her priest. Soon, the town knew of the ledgers. They knew that the horror was not rumor, but fact. The haunting truth of the records did more than confirm suspicions. It etched the tragedy into history. The babies were no longer just personal losses. They became part of a collective nightmare, a tally that grew with each birth. And then, an even darker realization spread. The numbers weren't slowing down. Month after month, the entries kept coming, as steady and relentless as the tide that battered Darwin's shore. By the end of 1917, nearly every infant born in the town was marked in those books. Each page turned like a slow tolling of a funeral bell. Each entry was a grave written in ink. The ledgers became more than records. They became a mirror of the town's fear. And deep inside those notes, hidden between the lines of clinical language, was the question no one dared to write. Was Darwin cursed or poisoned? The doctors of Darwin were trained to heal. They had faced malaria, dengue fever, and the wounds of war. But nothing in their education had prepared them for this. Every time a child was born without eyes, they gathered in hushed meetings behind closed doors. Medical charts spread across tables, lamps flickering against sweat-stained walls. The air was heavy with tobacco, smoke, and dread. They searched for patterns, diet, ancestry, even the weather on the day of each birth. But nothing fit. One doctor, a young man newly assigned to Darwin, believed he could solve it. He wrote letter after letter to medical boards in Sydney and Melbourne, pleading for guidance. Weeks later, replies trickled in. Most dismissed his claims as exaggerations. Others suggested malnutrition, syphilis, or genetic weakness. But none of those explanations made sense. Too many families were affected across too many backgrounds. The doctor's confidence began to crack. Their white coats, once symbols of authority, now felt like shrouds of failure. At night, they dreamed of eyeless children. They saw rows of cribs lined with tiny faces, all turned toward them, all staring with sockets that weren't there. Some woke screaming. Others stopped sleeping at all. Rumors began to creep into the medical wards. An old surgeon muttered that the water supply had been poisoned. A nurse claimed the military had brought chemicals through Darwin's port. Another whispered of curses, of sacred land disturbed by construction. But when they tried to speak publicly, the words died in their throats. Officials warned them to remain silent. Do not alarm the town, they were told. It will pass. Yet how could it pass when every new birth deepened the mystery? The frustration ate at them. Some began keeping their own secret journals, filled with observations they dared not submit to authorities. One physician described pressing a finger gently against the smooth skin where eyes should be. The sockets never formed, he wrote, his handwriting jagged. It is not injury. It is absence. The absence haunted him, because absence meant design. Something had stopped these children from forming the way they should. In time, the doctors began to fear not only the mystery, but themselves. Their failure to explain, their inability to protect, weighed on them like a curse. Patients no longer looked at them with trust, but with suspicion. Pregnant women recoiled from their touch, as if their hands carried some invisible plague. And yet, the most chilling part was not what they knew, but what they didn't. They couldn't say if it would spread beyond Darwin. They couldn't say if it would claim the next generation. They couldn't even say if the living infants would survive into childhood. The doctors of Darwin, men and women sworn to bring life into the world, became unwilling witnesses to its distortion. Each new case broke something inside them. By the end of 1917, many had left their posts, unable to bear the sight any longer. Those who remained no longer called themselves healers. They were record keepers, witnesses to a tragedy they could not stop. And in the silence of the hospital corridors, the question grew louder with each passing day. Was this natural, or was someone responsible? No words could prepare a mother for that first moment. The anticipation, the pain, the hours of labor, all of it building toward the promise of life. But in Darwin, 1917, that promise came broken. Imagine cradling a newborn, your heart pounding with relief, only to look down and see a face without eyes. No gaze to meet, no reflection of yourself, just smooth skin, unbroken, where windows to the soul should have been. The women of Darwin carried this horror in silence. Some screamed when they first saw their children, the sound echoing through the hospital halls. Others collapsed into stunned quiet, too numb to cry. But all of them were left with the same unbearable truth. They had given birth to shadows. For many, the shame was unbearable. Some refused to show their children to neighbors, wrapping their faces in cloth before stepping into the streets. Others hid indoors for weeks, terrified of stares, terrified of whispers. Husbands tried to reassure their wives, but their voices shook with the same unspoken fear. Was it her fault? Was it theirs? Families began to fracture. A few men abandoned their homes entirely, unable to face the sight of the child. Some women, under crushing despair, could not bring themselves to nurse. Babies were left in cots, rocking silently, their tiny fingers reaching into the void. The bond between mother and child, normally the most sacred connection, was tested to its breaking point. Love and revulsion tangled together. Mothers prayed over their infants, begged God to give them eyes, begged for a miracle. But none came. Churches overflowed with desperate women clutching their silent children. They lit candles, their tears dripping onto wooden pews. Priests spoke of God's mysterious ways, but even they avoided looking too long at the infants brought to the altar. Some suggested it was a punishment for sins. Others claimed it was a trial of faith. But faith faltered when faced with so many tiny, sightless faces. At night, the town was pierced by muffled sobs, the cries of women who couldn't speak their grief aloud. Some mothers confessed that they dreamed of their children chasing them, faceless, calling without voices. They woke drenched in sweat, terrified of the silence in the cradle beside them. What haunted them most was not just the deformity. It was the future. What kind of life awaited these children? Could they survive? Could they be loved? Could they ever belong to a world that recoiled at the sight of them? Some mothers clung to hope, insisting their babies were still blessings. They sang to them, rocked them, and whispered promises that no curse could break. Others slipped deeper into despair, treating their children as burdens, as curses themselves. The year 1917 became a quiet graveyard for joy. Birthdays brought no balloons, no laughter. Instead, they marked survival with heavy hearts. Darwin's mothers carried a grief that was not only personal, but collective. Each newborn became a reminder that none were spared, that something unnatural had taken root in their town. And though the hospital records and doctors tried to explain, it was the mothers who bore the weight. Their arms grew heavy with shadows. Their lives became haunted by the eyes that never opened. When the human heart cannot find answers, it invents them. By late 1917, Darwin was drowning in theories. None louder, none more persistent than the whispers of poisoned water. The town's lifeblood came from its wells and tanks, fed by rains that pounded the tropics. Yet the taste had turned strange that year. Bitter, metallic. Families muttered that their tea no longer tasted the same, that children who drank from the taps fell ill more often. Some claimed that even the animals sensed it, Horses refused to drink. Dogs sniffed and backed away. The rumors spread quickly. The water was cursed, not by spirits, not by fate, but by poison. Suspicion fell first on the military. Darwin, though small, was a strategic port during the war. Ships came and went, unloading crates of supplies and perhaps secrets. Locals swore they had seen barrels marked with strange symbols, lowered quietly onto the docks at night. Barrels that never appeared on shipping manifests. Barrels that disappeared before sunrise. Had chemicals leaked into the wells? Had something seeped into the soil? No one could prove it, but the thought burrowed deep into every household. Mothers boiled water twice before drinking. Some drew from distant creeks, walking miles under blistering heat, convinced the town's taps carried death. But no matter how carefully they rationed, the births continued. More babies, more shadows. Others blamed industry. Darwin's mines and railway brought dust and waste, spilled without care into the earth. Men who worked near the rail yards whispered of strange smells, of smoke that burned the lungs. One even claimed to have seen workers burying something behind the station, long after dark. When asked what, he shook his head and muttered, "Not meant for our eyes." The Aboriginal people who lived near Darwin had their own warnings. Elders spoke of poisoned land, of sacred sites disturbed by greed. They insisted that the earth itself was crying out, punishing those who had ignored its warnings. But settlers dismissed these words as superstition, until the babies kept being born blind, sightless, silent. Fear fed fear. By the final months of 1917, the town no longer trusted its own water. Every glass, every sip, carried suspicion. Pregnant women drank little at all, terrified of passing poison to the unborn. Some wasted away, growing weaker, their bodies trembling under both malnutrition and dread. And still, the doctors could not say. Tests of the wells showed nothing unusual, nothing that could explain an entire year of horror. Yet the mothers did not believe them. How could they? Something was destroying their children, and the water, so close, so constant, felt like the perfect culprit. The poison water theory became less of a rumor and more of a truth carved into the town's mind. Whether or not it was real didn't matter. It was a story people could cling to, a story they could share, a story that gave the tragedy a cause. Because the alternative was worse, that there was no reason at all. Darwin had always been a place of resilience. A frontier town battered by storms, heat, and isolation, yet still alive with markets, dances, and festivals. But in 1917, the music stopped. There were no more christenings with laughter spilling out of churches. No gatherings where proud fathers passed cigars and clapped each other on the back. Birthdays, if they were spoken of at all, were whispered in the dark, marked by tears instead of cake. The joy of new life had been stolen, replaced by dread. The streets grew quieter. Shops closed earlier. People avoided each other, afraid to ask questions that might cut too deep. The once bustling port town felt hollow, like its very spirit had been drained. Children, the few born before the curse year, noticed it most. They watched their parents move like shadows. They heard the whispers, saw the cloths wrapped over infants' faces, and wondered why no one celebrated anymore. Schoolyards that once echoed with games now felt haunted, the laughter thin and uneasy. The churches, too, changed. Bells still rang, but their sound carried sorrow, not joy. Inside, pews filled with grieving mothers clutching their silent babies. Priests tried to comfort them, but their sermons fell flat. Faith itself seemed to falter. After all, what kind of God would take the eyes of an entire generation? Even weddings, the last refuge of joy, were subdued. Brides wore white, grooms stood tall, but behind their smiles was terror. What future could they hope for, when the thought of children brought only nightmares? The markets told another story. Stalls once filled with laughter and bargaining now buzzed with suspicion. A woman carrying an infant drew stares. People leaned closer, straining to see if the child was one of them. Neighbors who had known each other for years stopped speaking, as though misfortune could spread by words alone. Superstition thickened the air. Some families hung charms above their doors, hoping to keep the curse away. Others smeared ash on the foreheads of newborns, believing it would fool the spirits into sparing them. Still, nothing worked, and so the town sank deeper into silence. Holidays came and went unnoticed. No lanterns were strung across the streets. No music drifted from verandas. Darwin stopped celebrating because celebration required hope, and hope had abandoned them. The absence of joy became its own kind of death. For a year, Darwin felt less like a town and more like a wake that never ended. The people moved through their days with bowed heads and heavy steps, their lives defined not by what they gained but by what they had lost. And though the silence spread outward into schools, markets, and churches, it began in the same place, the cradles of sightless children. Each infant became a reminder that the town's future was uncertain, perhaps already gone. Darwin was alive in 1917, but it no longer lived. It merely endured. Behind closed doors, the town's leaders scrambled. Officials, doctors, even church elders met in secret, desperate to understand what was happening to Darwin. They called it an investigation, but to the people, it felt more like a cover-up. Committees were formed. Papers were stamped. Reports were drafted and sealed away. Men in suits arrived from Sydney, carrying leather cases and quiet voices. They spoke little to the public, but their presence in the hospital halls was unmistakable. They examined the records, interviewed doctors, and then, just as suddenly, disappeared again. And nothing changed. Babies continued to be born without eyes. The people of Darwin grew restless. If there were investigations, why were there no answers? If experts had come, why had nothing improved? Whispers spread through the markets and pubs. The government knew more than it admitted. Some claimed the officials had already found the cause, but chose silence to protect reputations. Others muttered of classified reports, locked away because the truth was too dangerous to reveal. The more secretive the inquiries became, the louder the rumors grew. The nurses at Darwin Hospital spoke of men ordering them to destroy certain files. A dock worker swore he'd seen officials loading crates of medical samples onto a ship bound for the South, guarded as if they were treasures. None of it reached the newspapers. Not a single word was printed. The silence became a wound in the community. For every official who said, "We're investigating," there was a mother holding her blind infant, waiting for justice that never came. One doctor, unable to bear the secrecy, tried to leak his findings. He claimed he'd traced the tragedy to a chemical contaminant, possibly from military shipments. But before his letter could reach Sydney's papers, he vanished from Darwin entirely. Some said he'd been reassigned. Others whispered darker things, that he'd been silenced. His home was found empty, his journals missing. The message was clear. Those who spoke too loudly disappeared. By the end of 1917, the investigations had become less about finding truth and more about maintaining silence. Meetings were held in locked rooms. Reports vanished into drawers. And the people of Darwin realized something far more chilling than unanswered questions. The tragedy wasn't just happening to them. It was being hidden from the world. Darwin became an island of secrets, its cries smothered under the weight of bureaucracy and fear. The investigations promised clarity. Instead, they deepened the shadows. And in those shadows, the question grew sharper, cutting into every mind. If the officials knew the truth, what was so terrible that it could never be spoken aloud? When people could no longer trust doctors, priests, or officials, they turned to whispers. And in Darwin, those whispers soon pointed to one shadowy figure, the military. Darwin was not just a quiet coastal town. It was a strategic port, a staging ground for ships, supplies, and experiments the public was never told about. In 1917, with the Great War raging overseas, the military's presence in northern Australia grew heavier. Soldiers patrolled the docks. Strange cargo arrived under tarps. And at night, locals swore they saw lights flashing from restricted areas near the coast. It did not take long for suspicion to bloom. What if the babies were victims, not of nature, but of human hands? Stories multiplied. Dock workers claimed they'd seen barrels marked with chemical warnings unloaded at midnight. A fisherman swore that when he cast his nets too close to the harbor, his catch was rotten, the fish swollen and eyeless. Others told of a mist that rolled off the water some mornings, carrying a stench that clung to the skin. The military never answered questions. They denied everything. Yet the more they denied, the more people believed. Some said experiments were being conducted in secret, tests of gas, toxins, or medicines never meant for civilians. Darwin, remote and small, was the perfect testing ground. Few newspapers, fewer witnesses. If something went wrong, who would ever know? The rumors spread like fire. Families whispered that their babies were not cursed, but poisoned by the very men sworn to protect them. Pregnant women avoided the docks entirely, terrified that the air itself carried sickness. Men returning from shifts spoke of seeing soldiers in masks, their boots stained with something that wasn't mud. One chilling story told of a midwife who saw a group of military doctors enter the hospital at night. They demanded to see the newborns, examined them in silence, then left without a word. When she asked what they had found, one soldier simply said, "You didn't see us here." The theory of military experiments did more than frighten the town. It gave their suffering a new shape: betrayal. If true, then their tragedy wasn't an act of God or nature. It was a crime. But proof never surfaced. The rumors lived only in whispers, in the corners of pubs, in the diaries of grieving mothers. No report was ever released. No fest. And yet, the silence of officials, the secrecy of investigations, and the strange movements around the port all pointed to the same haunting possibility. The babies of Darwin were not victims of chance. They were casualties of something far more deliberate. By the time 1917 ended, Darwin was broken. Mothers carried silent children. Fathers carried shame. And the town itself seemed hollowed out, its laughter gone. Yet as the years passed, something even stranger happened. The story itself began to vanish. The hospital ledgers, once heavy with grim detail, grew thinner. Some were locked away, others mysteriously went missing. A few remained, but their pages were torn, names smudged, dates erased. It was as if someone wanted to scrub the year from existence. Newspapers from the time carried no headlines, no warnings, no acknowledgement of the tragedy that had consumed the town. In official archives, 1917 in Darwin looked unremarkable, just another year of war and weather. And so, what should have been remembered as one of the darkest medical mysteries in history became a silence almost as chilling as the births themselves. Families were left with nothing but memory. Mothers who had buried their children grew old, their voices trembling as they tried to explain what had happened to younger generations. But without records, without proof, their stories were dismissed as exaggeration, or worse, madness. Children born before 1917 carried scars of their own. They remembered the silence that fell over their households, the babies wrapped in cloth, the whispered prayers. Yet as they grew, they too were told to forget. Schools did not teach it. Doctors did not speak of it. Darwin became a place haunted by a tragedy it was forbidden to acknowledge. Some suspected deliberate erasure. Why else would every official document avoid the truth? Why else would so many ledgers go missing? Perhaps the government had ordered it buried to protect reputations. Perhaps the military had demanded silence to cover up experiments. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. By the 1920s, the year without eyes became a rumor more than a memory. A secret passed between families, muttered in old kitchens, repeated at night when storms rattled the tin roofs. But the silence did not erase the pain. For the women who had carried those children, every glance at the sea, every taste of the water, every sound of a baby's cry elsewhere in town, reopened the wound. Their grief was real, even if history tried to erase it. And so, Darwin became a ghost town of memory, its tragedy sealed away in missing pages and unspoken words. A case that should have shaken the world instead vanished in the shadows. Yet shadows never disappear completely. They wait, they linger, and sometimes they return. Time moved on. The war ended. New families came to Darwin. Buildings rose, storms passed, and the town rebuilt itself. Yet beneath the surface, 1917 never truly ended. For those who lived through it, the memories clung like humidity in the air. Mothers never forgot the weight of sightless infants in their arms. Fathers never forgot the shame of unanswered questions. And the children who grew up in that silence carried stories they were told never to repeat. Fear became part of Darwin's bloodline. Pregnant women decades later still boiled water twice, even when told it was safe. Some refused to give birth in town at all, traveling miles to other cities for delivery. They did not trust the land, the water, or the institutions that had failed them. Legends grew from the silence. Parents warned their children not to drink from certain wells. Fishermen avoided parts of the harbor, muttering about the year the sea went blind. Elders in Aboriginal communities whispered that the curse still lingered, waiting for the right moment to return. The government never acknowledged it. Doctors never published it. Historians rarely wrote of it. And so, the story became folklore, half memory, half myth. Some dismissed it as superstition, a tale invented to explain tragedies too heavy to bear. Others believed it was real, a suppressed scandal hidden in missing archives. Either way, the fear endured. Because whether it was poison, curse, or experiment, one truth could not be erased. For an entire year, in a single town, children came into the world without eyes. Today, whispers of the Darwin Case Study still ripple through old families. In diaries tucked away in trunks, in fragments of hospital records that escaped the fire, the truth remains waiting. Unfinished, unanswered. The legacy of fear is not just in what happened, but in what was hidden. A silence so heavy it smothered history itself. And in that silence lies the most haunting question of all. If it happened once, could it happen again?